The heavy, suffocating silence of the Virginia countryside, which until a few seconds ago was the only thing keeping Penelope standing, shattered with the sudden, savage roar of an approaching engine. It was not the sound of a standard passing truck or a slow farm vehicle wandering the back roads. It was the distinct, furious growl of a high-performance machine tearing through the rural landscape at a reckless speed. Penelope felt the vibration of the dry earth trembling beneath her blistered feet long before the vehicle even came into her line of sight. Her heart, which had already been pounding like a frantic war drum inside her chest after 6 grueling hours of continuous walking, seemed to freeze entirely. She whispered a desperate, breathless prayer into the hot afternoon air, her throat completely coated in a thick layer of road dust. Instinctively, her trembling arms, already burning with a fiery agony from the sheer physical impossibility of carrying 4 infants simultaneously, tightened their protective grip around the fragile bundles strapped to her body. The quadruplets, tiny shifting weights of warmth and innocent life, stirred uncomfortably against her chest, and back in their makeshift slings fashioned from torn bedsheets. Little Peter, whose tiny wrist bore a strange, rigid plastic tag, let out a soft, confused whimper, undoubtedly sensing the overwhelming waves of sheer panic radiating from his devoted nanny. Penelope pressed her exhausted body desperately against a rotting wooden fence that lined the deserted dirt road, praying silently that she could somehow merge with the decaying timber and vanish into the overgrown weeds. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. Behind her stretched an endless expanse of dry, unforgiving pasture land, and ahead lay the very dirt road that had officially transformed into her inescapable trap. An electric blue sports car came skidding wildly around the sharp bend, tearing up the earth and kicking up a massive, blinding curtain of suffocating brown dust. The high-end brakes shrieked with such a terrifying, violent intensity that Penelope squeezed her eyes shut and bowed her head low, curling her own battered body into a human shield over the 4 defenseless babies. She braced herself, fully expecting the devastating impact of the metal machine, but the vehicle slammed to a halt just a few feet away from her, the aggressive stop heavily pregnant with an impending sense of doom. The heavy silence returned to the Virginia landscape, but this time it was incredibly dense, suffocating, and charged with a dangerous electric tension. Penelope heard the powerful engine being cut off, followed immediately by the sharp metallic click of a heavy car door swinging violently open. She absolutely did not dare to lift her gaze from the dusty ground. She knew exactly who had stepped out of the vehicle, instantly recognizing that specific, expensive blend of imported cologne mixed with the faint scent of engine gasoline that always accompanied Frederick whenever his temper flared out of control. His booming voice completely ripped through the quiet rural air, not formulated as a question, but delivered as a final, inescapable death sentence. Penelope trembled violently from head to toe, and the babies, instantly infected by the overwhelming atmosphere of adult terror, began to squirm and fuss in their tightly bound sheet harnesses. William broke into a high-pitched, desperate wail, a sound of pure distress that pierced straight through Penelope's heart like a jagged piece of glass. She tried to whisper soothing words, promising them that their nanny was right there and would never let them go, but her dry lips completely refused to form the comforting sounds. Absolute terror had successfully paralyzed her vocal cords. She could hear Frederick's expensive leather shoes crunching heavily and rapidly over the loose gravel, each heavy footstep sounding like a judge's gavel striking the wooden block, bringing her closer and closer to her inevitable destruction. In her racing, panicked mind, a horrifying sequence of images flashed by with dizzying speed. The flashing lights of police cruisers, the cold bite of steel handcuffs around her wrists, the dark misery of a jail cell, and the most terrifying vision of all. She pictured the triumphant, cruel smirk, resting comfortably on Eleanor's deeply lined face, as the wealthy matriarch easily reclaimed the 4 infants to finish the sinister, unforgivable plan she had set into motion that very morning. Frederick roared into the dust-filled air, his normally smooth, refined baritone voice completely fractured by an uncontrollable, blinding rage. He ordered her not to move a single muscle, threatening dire consequences if she even attempted to take another step forward. Penelope slowly, fearfully raised her tear-filled eyes for the very first time since the car had violently skidded to a halt. Through the thick curtain of suspended dust and the blur of her own overflowing tears, she saw Frederick stomping toward her like a furious giant silhouetted against the bright, lowering afternoon sun. His impeccably tailored dark navy designer suit looked completely out of place in the wild Virginia brush, and his handsome face was entirely twisted into an unrecognizable mask of pure fury. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, burning with a wrath so profound it seemed to scorch the air between them. He did not see the utterly exhausted young woman trembling before him. He did not notice her once neat blue uniform now heavily stained with dried mud and sweat, nor did he see her cheap canvas shoes practically disintegrating off her bleeding feet. All Frederick saw was the deceitful criminal who, according to the frantic phone call he received from his mother, had selfishly stolen the only precious things that truly mattered in his incredibly complicated life. Penelope tightly clenched her jaw, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the 4 babies strapped against her aching torso. It was a physical burden that had completely numbed her lower back and legs over the past several hours, but it was a weight she swore to God she would never willingly surrender, even if someone tried to violently sever her arms from her body. Little Peter, completely oblivious to the towering, furious man aggressively marching toward them, innocently stretched out his tiny hand. Around his small wrist was a thick, unyielding plastic band, printed with a bizarre barcode, a terrifying mark that did not belong on a child. Penelope desperately snatched the baby's tagged hand and pressed it securely against her own wildly beating heart. She began murmuring a frantic, continuous prayer into the wind, begging the heavens to build an invisible wall between her and the approaching father, pleading for the strength to protect the innocent lives resting entirely in her bruised hands. The imposing man finally closed the distance between them, stopping abruptly so that his tall, broad shadow was cast entirely over Penelope and the children, completely blocking out the warming rays of the sun and extinguishing the last fleeting spark of her hope. Frederick stared down at her trembling form with an overwhelming mixture of sheer disgust, disbelief, and furious confusion. He spat his harsh words at her, lacing every single syllable with a deeply seated, venomous anger. He demanded to know exactly where she thought she could possibly go, accusing her of being completely out of her mind for attempting to casually walk across the state line carrying 4 stolen infants. He leaned down suddenly, aggressively invading Penelope's small perimeter of personal space. She instinctively shrank back, bumping her head painfully against the hard, unyielding wood of the weathered fence behind her. Yet she never once loosened her ironclad grip on the precious bundles secured around her chest. Frederick's immediate, primal instinct was to aggressively thrust his hands forward and physically rip the crying children away from her chest, but something completely unexpected made him freeze just inches away. There was an undeniably profound strength in Penelope's battered posture, a fierce, protective aura that had seamlessly transformed her fragile frame into an impenetrable human fortress surrounding his offspring. It made the furious billionaire hesitate for a fraction of a second. He sternly ordered her to hand them over immediately, extending a demanding, shaking hand toward the bundles, threatening that if she did not comply that very second, he would do something they would both deeply regret. The response that spilled from Penelope's chapped lips came out incredibly raspy, thoroughly exhausted, yet possessed an underlying foundation of pure, unshakable steel that genuinely caught Frederick completely off guard. She violently shook her head from side to side, her continuous silent tears carving clean, glistening pathways down her heavily dirt-streaked cheeks. She firmly declared that she would absolutely not surrender them to him, and in a tone he had never heard her use before, she commanded him to step back away from her. Frederick blinked rapidly, utterly astonished by the sheer audacity of the situation unfolding before him. The quiet, obedient nanny, who had always politely kept her eyes lowered, respectfully nodding and responding with nothing but soft affirmations, was suddenly shouting orders directly into his face. He aggressively stepped forward again, closing the tiny gap until his perfectly creased suit trousers were practically brushing against her mud-caked knees. He loudly reminded her that he was the biological father of those children, explicitly branding her a treacherous criminal and a greedy kidnapper. Frederick continued his verbal assault, declaring that his wise mother had been absolutely right about her all along. He claimed his mother had warned him ahead, just waiting for the perfect opportunity to snatch the heirs and demand a massive, multi-million-dollar ransom. A sharp, broken sob was violently torn from the very bottom of Penelope's stomach. She squeezed the crying little Isabella just a fraction tighter against her chest to soothe the infant's distress. Looking directly into his furious eyes, Penelope boldly stated that his mother was a chronic, despicable liar. Before she could even finish her sentence, Frederick furiously commanded her to shut her mouth. Blinded by rage, he fiercely punched the wooden fence post right next to Penelope's head. The decaying timber cracked loudly under the immense force of his knuckles, sending sharp splinters flying into the dusty air. Penelope squeezed her eyes tightly shut, completely bracing her body for a physical blow that miraculously never arrived. Frederick slowly pulled his shaking hand away from the splintered wood, his entire body trembling violently with unspent adrenaline. He menacingly warned her never to dare speak a single disrespectful word about his mother again. He recounted the frantic story his mother had spun, detailing how Penelope had supposedly raided the estate's secure vault, packing bags full of priceless family heirlooms, heavily stuffed envelopes of emergency cash, and vintage diamond jewelry, before callously snatching the quadruplets from their luxury nursery. Frederick swiftly scanned the immediate area around her, fully expecting to find heavy, stolen duffel bags overflowing with his family's vast wealth. Instead of stolen riches, his frantically searching eyes landed on a single, cheap canvas tote bag lying haphazardly in the dry grass nearby. Spilling out of its flimsy top was a half-empty plastic baby bottle, an open package of generic store-bought diapers, and a crumpled tube of diaper rash cream. The profoundly mundane sight momentarily short-circuited his furious logic, planting a tiny seed of profound confusion in his racing mind. However, the overwhelming surge of protective, paternal adrenaline was far too potent to allow him to process the glaring inconsistencies rationally. He turned his burning gaze back to her and harshly demanded to know where she had hidden the extorted money, aggressively questioning exactly how much cash she believed his 4 children were truly worth on the criminal market. The horrific accusation struck Penelope harder and deeper than any physical violence ever could. Her tear-filled eyes snapped wide open, and for the very first time since she had been employed at the sprawling Virginia estate, she stared directly into Frederick's intimidating eyes, without a single ounce of fear, possessing only a vast, endless ocean of profound disappointment. Her voice shook with immense, righteous indignation as she asked him if he honestly believed she was capable of putting a monetary price tag on the innocent souls she had raised. She gently pressed her dirt-smudged cheek against Peter's soft, warm head, her voice dropping into a fierce, heartbreaking whisper. She passionately declared that she had cared for those babies far more intensely than he ever had during his constant business travels, and she swore on her own life that she loved them significantly more than the cruel, heartless monster he blindly allowed to rule his grand mansion. Penelope desperately begged him to just truly look at his children, pleading with him to closely examine the terrifying truth hidden in plain sight. In response to the sudden tension, little Peter let out a jarring, high-pitched scream that did not sound like a standard baby's request for food or a nap. It was a sharp cry of distinct discomfort caused by the tight, unnatural band painfully chafing against his delicate skin. Hearing that unusual, distressing sound instantly activated Frederick's deeply buried paternal instincts, temporarily overriding his blinding rage. He aggressively grabbed Penelope by her slender arm, his strong fingers digging painfully into her tired muscles. He frantically demanded to know exactly what she had done to his son, his eyes zeroing in on the strange, clinical-looking plastic tag secured tightly around the infant's wrist. Penelope cried out in sheer desperation, entirely ignoring the sharp physical pain radiating from where his hand gripped her arm. She frantically screamed at him that she would gladly let him kill her right there on the dusty roadside before she ever allowed him to take the children back to that cursed house. She painted a horrifying picture, warning him that if they returned, his mother would undoubtedly finish the sinister plan she had set into motion. Frederick aggressively tried to pry her protective arms away from the screaming infants, engaging in a horrific, profoundly unequal physical struggle. He clearly possessed the superior physical strength of a grown man fueled by adrenaline, but Penelope possessed the absolute, terrifying desperation of a fiercely protective mother lion, defending the cubs she loved more than her own beating heart. Realizing that violently wresting the babies from her grasp was only terrifying the children further, Frederick abruptly stopped pulling. He roughly pulled his expensive smartphone from his tailored suit pocket using his free hand. Though he absolutely refused to release his vice-like Blake, he coldly announced his immediate intention to call Sheriff Barnes, viciously promising Penelope that she would spend the rest of her miserable life rotting away in the darkest, coldest prison cell the state of Virginia had to offer. Penelope watched in pure, unadulterated horror as the bright screen of the device illuminated the growing shadows of the late afternoon. She saw the absolute end of her own freedom, but more importantly, she looked down at the tiny, rigid transport band squeezing Peter's wrist. She knew with absolute terrifying certainty that if the police arrived, they would simply hand the children straight back to Eleanor, sealing their horrific fate forever. Penelope suddenly stopped fighting his physical hold entirely. Her sudden, eerie stillness was far more unsettling than her previous frantic struggling. She looked directly up at Frederick with an intensity so fierce and haunting it actually chilled the blood rushing through his veins. She boldly challenged him to make the phone call, daring him to bring the authorities down upon them. But before he condemned her to a prison cell, she demanded with a voice colder than winter ice that he find the courage to look closely at the evidence securely tucked inside her pocket and to read the horrifying tag his own mother had permanently locked onto his son's wrist. Frederick's thumb literally hovered over the bright green call button, paralyzed by the sheer unshakable conviction in her weary voice. The heavy, confusing sentence floated in the dusty air between them, completely disrupting his previously unwavering certainty. He quietly murmured a demand to know exactly what kind of insane lies she was desperately trying to spin to save her own skin. Penelope let out a deep, shuddering sob and gently lifted Peter's tiny arm so the restrictive plastic band was clearly visible in the fading sunlight. She pointed a trembling finger toward the strange barcode and the sinister, institutional serial numbers printed in stark black ink. She frantically explained that his mother had successfully finalized a horrific, secret transaction, fully intending to completely erase the children from existence to protect the family's pristine social reputation. Frederick's hand, holding the phone slowly, began to lower to his side. The poisonous seed of agonizing doubt began to aggressively send deep roots into his previously absolute, unwavering belief in his mother's innocence. He stared blankly at the thick, unyielding plastic band on a 6-month-old infant's wrist. It was a profoundly absurd, entirely grotesque sight that made absolutely no logical sense in the context of a loving, wealthy home. Seizing upon his momentary hesitation, Penelope reached into the deep pocket of her ruined uniform with incredibly shaky hands. She carefully pulled out a thick, folded stack of heavy official-looking documents. She asked him in a broken, haunting whisper if he truly believed she was the terrifying monster in this scenario, while hot, Bitter tears steadily fell onto the baby's soiled clothing. She boldly declared that the true monster was currently sleeping comfortably in the master suite of his luxurious estate. She forcefully shoved the heavily stamped documents against Frederick's chest, desperately begging him to simply open his eyes and read the terrifying truth for himself. Frederick took a slow, unsteady step backward, treating the folded papers as if they were highly radioactive, glowing material. Genuine doubt violently flickered across his dark eyes for a fleeting second, but the massive, impenetrable wall of elegant lies his mother had carefully constructed around him for his entire life was incredibly tall and deeply fortified. His rational mind desperately tried to reject the horrifying possibility that the lowly nanny could be speaking the absolute truth. He aggressively ran his free hand through his previously perfectly styled hair, completely messing it up as he shouted at her to stop her manipulative psychological games. He bitterly admitted that he had almost fallen for her pathetic crocodile tears, accusing her of being a brilliant, sociopathic actress trying to ruin his prestigious family name. Penelope completely ignored his harsh, biting insults. She lowered her gaze back down to the precious babies resting against her chest. Her hands, rough, heavily calloused, and deeply stained with dark Virginia mud, gently stroked Peter's tiny back with a profound, authentic tenderness that contrasted violently with the towering man's aggressive, intimidating posturing. She quietly replied, her voice incredibly raspy from severe dehydration and endless crying, that she was absolutely no actress. She reminded him with brutal, unflinching honesty that she was the absolute only living soul inside that sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion who genuinely cared if his children were fed, comforted, or properly put to sleep. She pointed out that while he was constantly flying across the globe signing massive corporate contracts, she was the only one consistently showing up for his children. Frederick kicked the dirt road with intense frustration, sending another thick cloud of brown dust swirling into the air, which immediately caused the infants to cough violently. He fiercely commanded her to stop speaking about his private life, harshly reminding her that he was the generous benefactor who had given her a lucrative job and a safe roof over her head when she had absolutely nowhere else to go. He expressed profound disgust at how she chose to repay his supposed kindness by treacherously stealing his children. He aggressively leaned down again, grabbing the cheap blue fabric of her uniform to forcefully haul her back onto her feet. He hissed through clenched teeth, ordering her to stand up immediately, loudly proclaiming that he would not tolerate watching her continue to drag his pristine children through the filthy dirt while looking like a pathetic, broken beggar. Penelope desperately tried to obey his harsh command, but her deeply exhausted muscles and numb legs completely failed her. She collapsed hard onto her knees with a sickening, heavy thud, a sharp cry of intense physical pain escaping her lips. However, even as she violently fell toward the unforgiving gravel, she miraculously twisted her torso in midair, ensuring that her own body absorbed the brutal impact, meticulously protecting the fragile babies from ever touching the harsh ground. It was an entirely instinctive, deeply sacrificial maneuver that spoke volumes. Frederick let out a bitter, cruel laugh, calling her current state utterly pathetic. He mockingly noted that she couldn't even manage to stand up on her own 2 feet, yet she somehow believed she possessed the capability to adequately provide for and protect 4 growing infants in the harsh outside world. He loudly recounted how his mother had warned him that very morning about Penelope's shifty eyes and her endless greedy hunger for their family's vast wealth. He berated himself for being a naive fool, admitting he had actually defended her character to his mother, insisting she was a good, honest worker. Penelope slowly lifted her head. The brilliant, fiery orange light of the setting sun struck her face directly, illuminating the steady stream of fresh tears, carving paths through the thick layer of dried mud on her skin. Despite her profoundly defeated, kneeling posture, there was a strange, undeniable, and immensely powerful dignity radiating from her entire being. She took a deep, shaky breath, fully aware that her next words could potentially seal her permanent fate in a state penitentiary, yet she boldly spoke the horrifying truth anyway. Penelope's voice was remarkably steady as she countered his mother's vicious lies. She explained that Eleanor had carefully fabricated the story about Penelope wanting money simply to ensure Frederick would never ask the crucial, damning questions. She wanted to prevent him from ever wondering why the children began sobbing in sheer terror every single time the esteemed matriarch's expensive heels clicked down the nursery hallway. Frederick's handsome face hardened into an impenetrable mask of pure stone. He abruptly raised his hand, effectively commanding her to stop talking, refusing to listen to another single syllable of her desperate defense. He purposefully raised his smartphone once more, his thumb aggressively tapping the glass screen as he dialed the direct number for Sheriff Barnes. He loudly announced his exact location on the old northern dirt road, demanding that the authorities send a police cruiser immediately alongside an ambulance, strictly for the children, coldly emphasizing that the treacherous nanny was to be hauled straight to the darkest holding cell available. Penelope felt the entire world suddenly grind to a horrifying, sickening halt. Frederick's authoritative voice, giving precise directions to the police dispatcher, sounded incredibly distorted and far away, as if she were desperately drowning deep underwater. She looked down at the 4 innocent faces resting against her chest. They were dozing softly now, completely oblivious to the terrifying reality that their tragic destiny was currently being permanently sealed by their own oblivious father. If the heavily armed police officers arrived, they would forcefully rip the babies from her protective arms and hand them directly back to Eleanor before the sun even fully set. Penelope knew with chilling certainty that the cruel matriarch would never, ever forgive them for this failed escape, and the children would mysteriously vanish to that overseas facility by morning. A quiet, desperate no slipped past Penelope's lips. The lingering cold fear inside her stomach rapidly mutated into a blinding, animalistic panic. Frederick was still holding the phone to his ear, his broad back turned completely toward her as he confidently paced a few steps toward his idling sports car, projecting the distinct aura of a highly victorious conqueror. He smoothly assured the sheriff that the suspect was currently immobilized, offering zero physical resistance, mockingly describing her as just a foolish, uneducated girl who had mistakenly believed she could outsmart his powerful family. Penelope stared intensely at the thick, unforgiving plastic transport band locked around Peter's tiny wrist. It was the undeniable physical proof of the nightmare, her absolute only remaining chance to shatter the billionaire's blinding illusion. With a sudden, terrifying scream that violently tore her throat raw, Penelope forced her battered body off the ground. A massive, unimaginable surge of pure adrenaline successfully erased the agonizing pain radiating from her heavily bleeding feet. She tightly secured her grip on the 4 children and launched herself directly toward Frederick. She was not trying to run away. She was aggressively attacking him with the undeniable truth. She practically crashed into his back, her free hand desperately grabbing the expensive lapel of his immaculate designer suit, instantly staining the fine fabric with thick, wet mud. Frederick shouted in genuine surprise, violently shoving her backward to create space. The expensive smartphone slipped from his grasp, tumbling hard onto the rocky dirt road. The open line to the police station remained active, projecting tinny, metallic voices demanding updates from the dusty ground. Penelope absolutely refused to let go of his suit. She clung to him with the desperate, terrifying strength of a drowning sailor clinging to the last floating piece of a shattered ship. She fiercely demanded that he truly look at his own son, aggressively lifting little Peter directly into Frederick's stunned line of sight. The sudden, jerky movement and the loud shouting deeply terrified the infant, causing Peter to instantly break into loud, distressed sobs. Penelope frantically pointed at the bizarre, thick tag around the baby's wrist, screaming over the child's cries. She challenged his ridiculous accusations, screaming that if she genuinely wanted his family's money, she could have easily emptied the hidden safes, taken the heavy gold watches, and vanished into the night. Instead, she demanded he notice that her only stolen cargo consisted of cheap diapers, half-empty formula bottles, and his 4 precious children. Frederick desperately tried to avert his eyes, severely uncomfortable with the intense, raw emotion practically exploding from her. He attempted to forcefully push her away again, but Penelope's grip on his clothing was driven by a supernatural, maternal strength. She aggressively shook the baby's tagged arm directly in front of his face, relentlessly insisting that he read the horrific typed words. She challenged him to ask his supposedly loving mother why a 6-month-old baby was currently wearing a non-removable institutional transport band typically reserved for high-security commercial cargo or anonymous hospital wards. Frederick's composed, arrogant billionaire mask finally began to violently crack under the intense pressure. He shouted back, his voice thick with profound confusion and rising panic, suggesting wildly that Penelope herself must have put the bizarre tag on the child for some sick, twisted psychological reason. Penelope violently shook her head, finally releasing her death grip on his ruined lapel. Her fingers were trembling so violently she could barely manipulate the thick paper documents she had pulled from her pocket. She aggressively shoved the papers directly against his chest, screaming that his elegant, respected mother had systematically arranged for these innocent children to be permanently shipped away to an unregistered, abusive facility located somewhere deeply off the grid. She revealed the terrifying truth. Eleanor had constantly complained that the children were a permanent, shameful stain on the family's immaculate legacy, a disgusting reminder of the surrogate mother who had supposedly ruined their pure bloodline. Frederick stood completely paralyzed on the dirt road. The horrific accusation was so incredibly massive, so thoroughly grotesque and unfathomable, that his highly logical corporate brain simply refused to process the information. He stared blankly at the folded documents she had forced into his hands, his strong voice suddenly dropping to a hoarse, terrified whisper as he slowly asked what kind of insane madness she was talking about. Penelope reached out and desperately tapped the thick plastic tag on Peter's wrist, then forcefully pointed to the bold, typed letterhead visible on the front page of the documents he was holding. She commanded him to read the name of the facility and to carefully examine the forged signature residing at the very bottom of the transfer agreement. Frederick slowly lowered his gaze to the papers in his hands. The brilliant, golden light of the late afternoon sun perfectly illuminated the crisp, black ink. He saw his own name, expertly forged in his mother's distinct, elegant handwriting, officially relinquishing all of his parental rights and legally transferring the 4 infants to an overseas institutional entity he had absolutely never heard of in his entire life. The heavy, oppressive reality of the situation crashed down upon Frederick with the devastating, crushing force of a collapsing skyscraper. Time seemed to freeze entirely on that isolated dirt road. The crickets abruptly stopped their evening song, and the gentle wind completely died down. Frederick's eyes darted frantically from the undeniable forged signature on the legal document to the cruel, unyielding plastic transport band securely locked around his tiny son's wrist. The horrifying pieces of the puzzle began violently snapping together in his mind. He distinctly remembered the endless, hushed phone calls his mother would take behind locked mahogany doors, suddenly switching to French whenever he walked past. He remembered her frequent, cold comments about the children being a highly regrettable, extremely expensive mistake that needed to be swiftly corrected for the sake of his future political and corporate ambitions. Penelope let out a deep, shuddering sob that seemed to tear from her very soul. She slowly dropped to her knees right there in the dirt, the adrenaline completely leaving her battered body, yet she somehow managed to keep the baby safely elevated in her arms. She looked up at Frederick, with eyes completely hollowed out by sheer exhaustion and terror. She confessed that his mother had confidently handed the terrifying broker the envelope of cash right there in the grand foyer, fully believing Penelope was out running errands. She explained, her voice cracking with every word, that the sketchy, unmarked transport van was scheduled to arrive at the estate's back gates right at midnight. If she had not frantically packed them into the old broken stroller and desperately run into the woods, the very second Eleanor turned her back, the children would have mysteriously disappeared before the sun even rose, and Eleanor would have simply handed him heavily falsified death certificates upon his return from his business trip. Frederick continued to stare blankly at the highly incriminating documents trembling in his hands. His highly analytical brain was desperately attempting to aggressively reject the horrifying reality presented before him, but the undeniable physical evidence was absolutely overwhelming. He vividly recalled the strange, unfamiliar men in dark suits he had occasionally seen lingering uncomfortably near the estate's service entrance over the past month. He remembered his mother's frantic, unusually aggressive insistence that he extend his current business trip to Europe by an extra week, citing trivial, non-existent corporate emergencies. The terrifying word relinquishment seemed to aggressively burn itself directly into his retinas, leaving a permanent, searing scar. He dropped the heavy papers onto the dusty ground as if they had suddenly burst into roaring flames. Penelope slammed her bruised fist fiercely against the hard dirt road. She screamed into the cooling evening air, demanding that he allow the police to come and arrest her, daring him to lock her away in a dark cell for the rest of her natural life. However, she passionately begged him, swearing by everything he held sacred in the world, not to let that evil woman ever touch his innocent children again. She sobbed violently, pleading with him to kill her right there on the road if he had to, but to please fundamentally save his own flesh and blood from a fate far worse than death. The heavy, terrible confession hung thickly in the dusty air. From the rocky ground nearby, the dropped smartphone continued to emit urgent metallic noises. The police dispatcher's voice repeatedly demanded his location, assuring him that heavily armed units were currently less than 2 miles away and closing in rapidly to secure the supposed kidnapping scene. Frederick, however, was completely deaf to the urgent voice of the authorities. The only sound echoing violently inside his mind was the deafening, catastrophic sound of his own heart, shattering into a million jagged pieces. The foundation of his entire reality, his immense wealth, his respected family name, his profound trust in his own mother, had just been entirely annihilated in the span of 5 agonizing minutes. Frederick slowly fell to his knees in the dust. It was not a conscious, planned decision. His strong legs simply refused to support the immense, crushing weight of his own profound guilt and monumental ignorance any longer. With a heavily shaking hand, he slowly reached out toward little Peter. He didn't reach for the plastic tag this time, but instead gently cupped his large hand around the infant's soft, tear-stained cheek. The warmth radiating from the baby's skin was incredibly real, anchoring him to the present moment. He leaned his head forward, deeply inhaling the scent of the child. Beneath the heavy layer of road dust and dried sweat, there was the faint, sweet scent of the generic baby soap Penelope had desperately managed to pack. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the cold, sterile, empty environment his mother had actively tried to force these children into. Frederick whispered the words sold into the wind, the horrifying syllable escaping his pale lips like a dark, terrible curse. He realized with sickening clarity that his mother had not just neglected them, she had actively, methodically orchestrated a plan to sell them into an absolute void, treating his children like inconvenient, defective merchandise that severely damaged the prestigious family brand. Penelope, who had been holding her breath in sheer terror, let out a massive, muffled sob of pure relief. Watching the incredibly powerful, universally feared billionaire forcefully brought to his knees in the dirt, completely confronted with the horrifying brutality of his own mother's actions, gave her a sudden, immense burst of renewed strength. She quietly explained to him that Eleanor constantly complained that the children carried the filthy, unacceptable blood of the surrogate, declaring them utterly unworthy of walking on the estate's imported Italian marble floors. Penelope described how she had silently watched Eleanor actively banish the babies to the freezing, entirely unfinished attic rooms whenever wealthy guests arrived, forcing Penelope to quietly comfort them in the biting cold while the elegant parties raged endlessly downstairs. Frederick slowly lifted his gaze from the dusty ground. His dark eyes, which just moments ago had been entirely filled with a cold, highly calculated fury, were now completely overflowing with a profound, unadulterated terror. He truly looked at Penelope for the very first time. He no longer saw a treacherous thief or a manipulative kidnapper. He finally saw the absolute, raw terror radiating from her exhausted eyes, recognizing that her profound fear was never about the police or a prison sentence. Her sheer panic was entirely based on the terrifying possibility that he, the children's own father, might actually help his mother finish her sinister evil task. As if sensing the shifting emotional tide, little Peter whimpered softly and aggressively buried his face deep into the comforting fabric of Penelope's chest, instinctively seeking refuge from his own biological father. That single, profoundly heartbreaking gesture of an infant naturally seeking absolute safety in the arms of a hired employee rather than his own parent felt like a heavily serrated dagger plunging directly into Frederick's chest. On the ground beside them, the smartphone suddenly vibrated violently, ringing loudly. Frederick reacted with a sudden, intense burst of aggressive energy. He practically lunged forward and snatched the expensive device from the dirt, his knuckles turning stark white from the immense pressure of his grip. Penelope instantly curled her body tighter around the baby's, terrified he might use the heavy phone as a weapon against her. But Frederick completely ignored her. He stared intensely at the brightly illuminated screen, watching the name Sheriff Barnes flashing urgently in bold letters. His thumb hovered heavily over the bright red disconnect button. His previous, unwavering certainty had completely vanished into thin air, entirely replaced by a burning, furious truth that was currently consuming his soul from the inside out. He knew exactly what would happen if the heavily armed authorities arrived right now. They would forcefully take the screaming babies, hand them directly over to the highly respected, wealthy matriarch of the community, and by morning, the tragic, falsified death certificates would be legally filed while his children vanished forever into an underground nightmare. With a swift, incredibly decisive motion, Frederick violently pressed the red button, instantly terminating the active call. The profound, heavy silence that immediately followed on the dusty road was absolutely deafening. By cutting that phone line, Frederick had not just ended a call. He had permanently, irreversibly severed his lifelong alliance with his cruel mother, drastically altering the entire trajectory of his life. Frederick's voice was completely unrecognizable when he finally broke the heavy silence. It sounded incredibly rough and heavily textured, as if he had been swallowing sharp, broken glass. He quietly demanded to see the other children, desperate to ensure they were safe. Penelope instantly scrambled backward on the dirt road, her protective instincts severely overriding her exhaustion. She aggressively shielded the other 3 infants with her battered body, shaking her head frantically. She absolutely refused to let him near them, deeply terrified he might still snatch them away and blindly return them to the estate to face Eleanor's wrath. Frederick fiercely pounded his large fist onto the dusty ground, raising another thick cloud of dirt. He desperately pleaded with her, his voice breaking, stating that he needed to know they were okay, begging her to simply let him look at his own flesh and blood. Hearing the powerful, universally intimidating billionaire actually use the word please shattered the massive, invisible wall between them. During the grueling 2 years Penelope had worked inside the sprawling Virginia mansion, Frederick had only ever issued cold, highly direct commands, demanding absolute silence and perfect order from his staff. Now he was literally begging on his knees in the dirt. Slowly, with hands shaking so violently she could barely manipulate the fabric, Penelope carefully pulled back the heavily soiled, torn blanket covering little Isabella's legs. Frederick eagerly crawled forward on his hands and knees, completely ignoring the sharp, jagged rocks aggressively tearing through the expensive fabric of his suit trousers and slicing into his skin. He reached the baby girl with a profound, entirely unexpected gentleness. He carefully examined the children. They were incredibly filthy, covered in sweat, road dust, and dried mud, but remarkably, miraculously, they were physically unharmed. There were no bruises, no cuts, only the severe, undeniable signs of deep physical exhaustion and the cruel plastic transport tags secured tightly around each of their tiny, fragile wrists. Frederick felt a massive wave of sudden nausea wash over him. A bitter, highly acidic taste rapidly rose in the back of his throat. He had to plant his hands firmly in the dirt and lower his head deeply between his shoulders to prevent himself from completely passing out. Horrifying, crystal-clear memories of his mother's actions flashed through his mind like a terrifying horror film. Eleanor smiling brightly at highly publicized charity galas. Eleanor coldly stating that the children required strict discipline and extended isolation to build character. Eleanor looking at them with thinly veiled disgust whenever they made a sound. He had been incredibly, monumentally blind. No, worse than completely blind. He had been entirely, willingly absent from their lives, preferring the pristine, quiet comfort of his corporate offices over the chaotic reality of fatherhood. Penelope softly pointed to baby William, who was sleeping restlessly against her shoulder. She quietly revealed that the aggressive allergies the expensive private doctor had continuously diagnosed were entirely fake. Eleanor had intentionally been feeding them cheap, heavily expired formulas she bought secretly, pocketing the massive, luxurious nursery budget for her own private accounts. Frederick squeezed his eyes shut as a deep, primal, guttural roar began violently forming deep within his chest. It was not a battle cry. It was the horrifying, agonizing sound of a grown man realizing he had willingly left his entirely defenseless lambs in the direct care of a starving, vicious wolf. He suddenly bolted upright, staggering heavily on his feet like a deeply intoxicated man. He paced frantically in tight circles in the middle of the road, aggressively running his hands through his hair and tugging at the roots with pure desperation. He stared wildly at the darkening Virginia sky, and then down the long, empty stretch of dirt road where the heavy police cruisers were undoubtedly still speeding toward them. He turned back to Penelope, his dark eyes wide and frantic, acknowledging that the heavily armed police were actively coming to arrest her and effectively rescue the children, only to hand them directly back to their absolute worst nightmare. Penelope slowly lowered her head, the heavy weight of inevitable defeat crushing her shoulders. She quietly accepted her fate, simply asking him to promise that when they took her away in handcuffs, he would blame her for everything, but to swear he would never let his mother near the babies again. She told him that if he personally stayed with them and protected them, they would be perfectly fine. She looked up at him with a heartbreaking sincerity and gently stated that he wasn't a fundamentally bad person. He was simply never there. That specific, undeniable sentence struck Frederick significantly harder than any physical blow ever could. You simply weren't there. It was the absolute, undeniable truth of his greatest sin as a father. His dark, guilt-ridden gaze slowly drifted toward the cheap canvas tote bag Penelope had dropped, the very bag his mother claimed was heavily stuffed with millions of dollars in stolen jewelry and cash. He walked over to it, grabbed the flimsy bottom, and violently dumped its entire contents onto the dusty hood of his expensive sports car. He was desperately hoping to hear the heavy clinking of gold or see stacks of cash to somehow justify his earlier rage. Instead, absolute, profound misery and undeniable love spilled out onto the gleaming blue paint. There were a few crumpled, highly generic diapers, a half-empty plastic canister of the cheapest baby formula available, a completely empty plastic water bottle, a torn package of plain crackers, and a small, cracked plastic wallet. Frederick picked up the cheap wallet with trembling fingers and slowly opened it. Inside were a few heavily wrinkled, low-denomination dollar bills and some loose coins. It was Penelope's entire life savings, every single penny she possessed in the world. Frederick's voice shook violently as he asked if this pathetic pile of basic survival items was truly everything she had taken. He noted in sheer disbelief that she hadn't even taken his limitless black credit card, which he carelessly left sitting openly on the marble table in the grand foyer. Penelope, still sitting heavily in the dirt and clutching the babies, gently shook her head. She softly explained that she was not a thief, clarifying that the few crumpled dollars were the remains of her meager weekly salary, which she had been desperately trying to save to send back to her sick mother. She explained that she had completely drained her savings buying proper food and medicine for the babies out of her own pocket because Eleanor refused to provide any funds. Frederick literally felt the air aggressively, violently sucked straight out of his lungs. She had willingly spent her own absolute poverty to keep his children alive, and she had frantically fled into the unknown wilderness with absolutely no money and no plan, driven entirely by the overwhelming terror of seeing them suffer. Frederick finally looked closely at Penelope's feet. He saw her cheap canvas shoes completely destroyed, the soles ripped off, and the heavy, dark stains of dried blood soaking through the thin fabric. She had walked for miles on sharp rocks carrying 4 infants, while he had arrived in a climate-controlled luxury car planning to destroy her life. Frederick felt his strong legs threaten to give out completely beneath him once again. He leaned heavily against the sleek side of his sports car, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his burning lungs. He stared blankly down at his own impeccably shined, highly expensive Italian leather shoes, a profound wave of self-disgust washing over him. His voice cracked with a heavy, unbearable weight as he asked her why she hadn't simply picked up the phone and told him what his mother was secretly doing behind his back. Penelope slowly lifted her exhausted gaze, her large, incredibly sad eyes fixing directly onto his face. She quietly explained that she had desperately tried to inform him at least 3 different times during the past week, specifically recalling the moment he had returned from his prolonged European business trip. Frederick tightly squeezed his eyes shut, aggressively forcing his own memory to violently rewind to those exact moments. Yes, he vividly remembered sitting in his expansive, mahogany-paneled home office, intensely focused on aggressively revising massive corporate merger documents. He remembered Penelope nervously standing in the massive doorway, frantically twisting her hands together, softly stating that she urgently needed to discuss the children's welfare. And what had he done? He had dismissively waved his hand without even bothering to look up from his important paperwork, coldly instructing her that he was far too busy and that if the nursery required anything, she should simply speak directly to his mother. Penelope's soft voice broke into his dark thoughts, completely void of anger or reproach, carrying only an infinite, crushing sadness as she recounted his exact words. She told him that when she desperately tried to insist that the matter was urgent, he had physically walked over and firmly shut the heavy office door directly in her face, coldly, stating that he paid her a salary specifically so he would never have to deal with trivial domestic problems. Frederick buried his face deeply into his trembling hands, a horrific, agonizing groan violently escaping his tight throat. So I wouldn't have to deal with trivial domestic problems. Those were his exact, unforgivable words. He had selfishly, willingly traded the absolute safety and well-being of his own flesh and blood for the quiet, uninterrupted convenience of his demanding corporate lifestyle. He had essentially sold his own fatherhood for absolute silence. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing wail of a police siren completely shattered the heavy emotional moment. Frederick's head snapped up violently, the harsh reality of their immediate situation aggressively punching him in the gut. If the heavily armed police officers arrived right now and found Penelope looking like a desperate fugitive sitting in the dirt with 4 kidnapped babies, they would immediately violently tackle her, slap cold steel handcuffs onto her wrists, and throw her into the back of a caged cruiser. The children would be immediately handed over to social services or directly to Eleanor, and his mother would achieve an absolute, horrifying victory. Frederick desperately looked over at Penelope and saw the sheer, unadulterated panic violently return to her exhausted eyes. Hearing the approaching sirens, she immediately began clumsily gathering the scattered diapers from the dirt, fully preparing herself to surrender to the authorities to protect the children from a physical altercation. Frederick's voice was completely transformed when he spoke next. The terrifying tremble of guilt was entirely gone, completely replaced by a brand-new, highly imposing firmness that seemed to miraculously rise from the ashes of his destroyed ego. He firmly commanded her to stop what she was doing. He swiftly removed his ruined, expensive designer suit jacket and carelessly tossed it onto the dusty, rock-covered ground. He rapidly rolled up the sleeves of his previously immaculate white dress shirt, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute determination. He stepped forward and firmly demanded that she hand Peter and Isabella over to him. It was not phrased as a cold command this time, but rather an urgent, desperate necessity. He loudly pointed out that she could not possibly carry all 4 of them, and her bleeding feet would completely fail her before she took another step. Penelope hesitated, her terrified eyes darting toward the rapidly approaching sound of the heavy sirens stammering about the police. Frederick loudly cursed the police, explicitly stating that he absolutely did not care about them or his own mother. He swore with a terrifying intensity that absolutely no one was going to take her anywhere, and no one would ever dare to lay a single finger on her or the babies again. He turned his intense gaze directly toward the long dirt road, where the bright, violently flashing blue and red lights were just beginning to reflect off the distant darkened trees. His jaw muscles clenched tightly, visibly bunching under his skin. A profound, irreversible transformation had just occurred on that isolated stretch of Virginia Road. The arrogant, entirely absent corporate billionaire had effectively died in the dirt, and a fiercely protective, terrifyingly motivated father had finally been born. The aggressive red and blue lights of the heavy police cruiser violently swept across the dry, open fields, completely painting the chaotic scene in a jarring, highly stressful strobe effect. The deafening wail of the siren died abruptly as the heavy official vehicle slammed its brakes hard directly behind Frederick's expensive sports car, kicking up a second massive wave of choking brown dust. Penelope's entire body went completely rigid with sheer terror. She watched closely as the heavy doors of the cruiser aggressively swung open. 2 heavily armed officers stepped out with highly coordinated, rapid tactical movements. Sheriff Barnes, a broad-shouldered, incredibly stern man, stepped forward with his hand resting heavily on his holstered weapon. His younger, highly nervous partner immediately drew his firearm, keeping it pointed strictly toward the dirt but clearly prepared to raise it at a moment's notice. The younger officer aggressively shouted, a loud, highly authoritative command, loudly ordering everyone to put their hands directly into the air and to immediately step away from the innocent minors. Penelope's heart was hammering so violently against her ribs, she felt it might actually break her bones. She desperately tried to raise her trembling hands, but her arms were completely occupied, securely holding on to Peter and Isabella. The overwhelming wave of sheer panic completely immobilized her on the dusty ground. The older sheriff took a highly aggressive step forward, clearly mistaking her frozen state of terror for active defiance, and loudly repeated his harsh command for her to drop to the ground. Penelope simply squeezed her eyes tightly shut, curling her battered body entirely over the fragile babies, willingly offering her own back as the absolute primary target, and desperately begged them not to shoot. It was at that exact, terrifying moment that Frederick's towering frame deliberately stepped directly into the dangerous space between Penelope and the drawn police weapons. Frederick did not nervously raise his hands, nor did he cower or shrink back in fear. He aggressively marched straight toward the heavily armed officers with a cold, highly controlled fury that was significantly more intimidating than any loud shouting could ever be. His previously pristine white dress shirt was heavily stained with brown mud and the tears of his children, and his hair was wildly messed up by the wind and his own desperate hands, but his imposing physical presence was undeniably that of a highly powerful man firmly reclaiming absolute control of his chaotic world. He unleashed a booming, highly authoritative command, demanding they lower their weapons immediately. The sheer, unquestionable authority vibrating in Frederick's deep voice was so incredibly potent that the highly nervous younger officer actually hesitated, instinctively lowering the dark barrel of his gun a few crucial inches. Sheriff Barnes squinted against the flashing cruiser lights and immediately recognized the highly influential billionaire, despite his unusually disheveled and dirty appearance. The sheriff blinked in profound confusion, desperately trying to mentally process the bizarre scene unfolding before him. The wealthy man who had frantically called them claiming his children were violently kidnapped was now actively using his own large body as a physical human shield to protect the supposed dangerous kidnapper sitting in the dirt. The sheriff nervously ordered Frederick to step aside so they could easily apprehend the highly dangerous suspect. The sheriff made a swift, tactical hand gesture, signaling his younger partner to aggressively advance toward Penelope with heavy steel handcuffs drawn. As the young officer took a rapid step forward, Frederick violently shoved the man forcefully in the center of his armored chest with enough raw physical power to send the officer stumbling clumsily backward several feet. The heavy silence that instantly fell over the dusty road was absolute and incredibly thick with tension. The sheriff instantly tensed his entire body, his hand gripping the heavy handle of his holstered firearm tightly, loudly accusing Frederick of losing his mind. The sheriff sharply reminded the billionaire that he was the one who had urgently called the police, officially reporting a violent kidnapping, and warned him that interfering with an act of arrest would result in immediate, highly severe legal consequences. Frederick absolutely did not move a single millimeter. He firmly planted his expensive leather shoes securely into the Virginia dirt, effectively transforming himself into a highly impenetrable, solid human barrier positioned directly in front of the deeply terrified nanny and his 4 crying children. He spoke with a cold, highly precise, and incredibly cutting tone, his words hitting the officers like heavy, solid stones. He flatly stated that he had made a massive, unforgivable mistake, loudly declaring that there was absolutely no kidnapping occurring here. The sheriff let out a highly nervous, utterly incredulous laugh, loudly questioning how there could possibly be no kidnapping when they had just found the suspect hiding 30 miles away from his sprawling estate, cowering in the dirty brush with his missing children. Frederick aggressively closed the physical distance between himself and the sheriff, violently invading the officer's personal space with a highly intimidating posture that forced the seasoned lawman to instinctively take a step backward. Frederick loudly demanded that the sheriff look closely at the young woman sitting in the dirt behind him. He aggressively pointed back toward Penelope, who was still trembling violently on the ground, her heavily bleeding feet highly visible through the completely destroyed canvas of her cheap shoes. Frederick's voice suddenly cracked with a profound, highly painful mixture of intense sorrow and blinding rage, asking the sheriff if she honestly looked like a highly sophisticated, dangerous, international criminal. He firmly declared that this battered, exhausted woman was the absolute only reason his 4 children were still breathing the air today. Penelope slowly raised her tear-filled eyes, utterly astonished by the unfolding scene. Never once in her entire, highly difficult life had a powerful authority figure ever actively stood up and fiercely defended her against the law. Hearing Frederick, the incredibly wealthy, highly intimidating man who just 10 minutes prior had aggressively threatened to throw her into a dark prison cell, now violently fighting the armed police to protect her, caused something heavy and painful inside her chest to permanently break. A massive, previously heavily contained dam of deep, highly complex emotions suddenly overflowed. The highly confused sheriff nervously stammered, awkwardly bringing up the highly detailed official kidnapping report Frederick had aggressively filed just an hour ago over the phone. Frederick swiftly and ruthlessly cut the sheriff off, loudly and officially retracting his previous statement. He boldly lied directly to the faces of the heavily armed officers, smoothly stating that there had been absolutely no robbery and definitely no kidnapping. He fabricated a highly plausible story on the spot, claiming it was simply a massive domestic misunderstanding, insisting he had personally ordered Penelope to take the children for a long, scenic drive, and unfortunately, their secondary vehicle had unexpectedly broken down on this highly isolated road. It was a completely absurd, highly transparent lie, considering there was absolutely no broken-down vehicle anywhere in sight on the empty road. However, Frederick delivered the bold fabrication with such intense, unwavering conviction, heavily backed by the immense unspoken power of his multi-billion-dollar family name, that the transparent lie instantly became the highly official, unquestionable truth in that exact moment. Frederick significantly lowered his powerful voice to a dark, highly threatening whisper, firmly informing the sheriff that Penelope would absolutely not be going anywhere with them. He warned the officers that if either of them even dared to lay a single finger on her, he would personally guarantee they would be permanently transferred to the most highly remote, deeply undesirable posting in the entire state of Virginia by tomorrow morning. The sheriff swallowed heavily, acutely aware of the vast, highly destructive political power the billionaire's family actively wielded within the state. He nervously looked at the highly exhausted nanny, then at the crying infants, and finally at Frederick's highly imposing, defiant posture. The sheriff heavily sighed, reluctantly pulling a small notepad from his pocket, stating he would require Frederick's official signature to permanently close the highly irregular case. When the sheriff nervously mentioned that Eleanor, the highly respected matriarch of the family, had also urgently contacted the station demanding immediate action, Frederick's dark eyes instantly turned entirely black with an unholy fury. He instructed the officer, with a voice so incredibly cold it practically froze the humid Virginia air, to completely ignore his mother. He boldly stated that Eleanor no longer possessed any authority, voice, or legal standing regarding the lives of his 4 children. He aggressively snatched the small notepad from the sheriff's hands and violently scribbled his signature across the official form, pressing the pen down so incredibly hard he almost completely tore the fragile paper in half. Once the heavily armed officers finally retreated into their cruiser and slowly drove away, kicking up a final cloud of dust, the profound silence returned to the isolated road. However, it was no longer the heavy, terrifying silence of impending doom. It was the quiet, deeply profound silence of a massive, life-altering pact that had just been officially sealed in the dirt. As soon as the flashing blue lights completely disappeared behind the distant rolling hills, Frederick's highly imposing titangent-like posture completely collapsed. His broad shoulders violently slumped forward, and he let out a long, incredibly shaky breath that seemed to carry the weight of his entire destroyed life. He immediately turned around and rushed back to Penelope's side. She was still sitting heavily on the dusty ground, desperately trying to wipe the dirt from Isabella's face using the corner of her heavily soiled, ruined uniform, completely consumed by profound embarrassment over her own highly disheveled, filthy appearance. She quietly murmured a deeply sincere apology without ever making eye contact, apologizing for causing such a massive, highly chaotic problem, stating she never wanted him to aggressively fight the armed police on her behalf. Frederick absolutely did not respond with words. He swiftly marched over to his expensive sports car, forcefully popped the trunk, and returned carrying a highly advanced, professional-grade red medical kit, the type of expensive emergency equipment that comes standard in luxury vehicles but is almost never actually used. He dropped heavily to his knees directly in the dirt in front of her, completely ignoring the sharp rocks tearing further into his ruined trousers. His voice was incredibly soft, almost entirely unrecognizable from his usual booming tone, as he firmly commanded her to never, ever apologize to him again for protecting his innocent children. His large, masculine hands were shaking violently as he quickly unzipped the red medical bag, pulling out sterile gauze pads, high-grade antiseptic spray, and a pair of sharp medical scissors. He gently pointed toward her heavily bleeding, completely destroyed feet, stating that he desperately needed to clean the deep wounds immediately before they became severely infected by the thick dirt. Penelope instinctively jerked her legs backward, desperately trying to hide her bloody feet beneath the long, heavily soiled hem of her blue uniform. The profound sense of deep social shame was almost entirely unbearable. The highly disturbing idea that the powerful billionaire, who normally smelled of expensive cologne and absolutely refused to touch anything remotely dirty, was actively preparing to touch her highly filthy, bleeding feet, was simply too much for her deeply ingrained sense of humility to handle. She nervously stammered, desperately begging him to stop, insisting she was perfectly fine and could easily clean the wounds herself once they finally returned to the estate. She frantically stated she absolutely did not want to dirty his highly expensive hands. Frederick completely stopped his movements and looked directly into her deeply panicked eyes. His dark pupils were highly dilated, completely filled to the brim with a raw, undeniable, and immensely profound emotional pain. He slowly extended his large hand, the very same hand that effortlessly signed multi-million-dollar corporate contracts and fired hundreds of employees without a second thought, and simply left it hovering gently in the space between them, silently asking for her permission. He softly pleaded with her, his voice breaking, stating that he desperately needed to do this for her. Penelope instantly understood, simply by looking deep into the profound despair swimming in his dark eyes, that this highly intimate act of tending to her bloody wounds was absolutely not just for her physical benefit. Frederick desperately needed to physically heal her injuries in order to slowly begin the incredibly long, highly painful process of healing his own deeply shattered soul. He desperately needed to personally clean the actual blood that his own massive, highly negligent absence had directly caused her to shed. It was his immediate, deeply necessary physical penance. Slowly, with her entire body shaking uncontrollably, Penelope carefully extended her injured right leg toward him. Frederick gently grasped her small ankle with an extreme, profound delicacy, treating her battered leg as if it were a highly fragile piece of priceless crystal that might shatter at any moment. Using the sharp medical scissors, he highly carefully cut away the heavily blood-soaked, ruined canvas material of her cheap shoes that had completely fused to her raw, bleeding skin. Penelope let out a highly muffled, sharp gasp of intense pain as the sticky fabric violently tore away from her deep blisters. Frederick repeatedly whispered profound apologies into the quiet air, highly carefully spraying the strong antiseptic wash over the deep wounds. His large hands meticulously wiped away the thick mud and dried blood with a profound tenderness that contrasted violently with the brutal, highly aggressive nature of the injuries themselves. He softly cursed himself, calling himself a highly massive idiot, firmly stating that this entirely horrific situation was absolutely his fault. Penelope softly disagreed, pointing out that he simply didn't know the truth. Frederick aggressively clenched his jaw tightly, quickly finishing wrapping the thick, sterile bandages tightly around her first foot before immediately starting on the second. He argued that a real father is absolutely supposed to know, fiercely stating that there is absolutely no valid excuse for his immense ignorance. He bitterly confessed that he had blindly allowed his mother to completely transform his home into a highly dangerous, abusive environment, acknowledging that he had almost sent the only person who cared about his children to a dark prison cell. He finished firmly securing the bright white bandages, but absolutely did not stand up. Instead, he remained kneeling in the dirt, gently holding both of Penelope's highly bandaged feet resting softly on his ruined knees. He looked up at her, stating that her incredible bravery today had successfully taught him the ultimate, most profound lesson on what it truly means to be a protective parent. Penelope's eyes instantly filled with a fresh, highly overwhelming wave of warm tears as she looked down at the incredibly powerful man still kneeling humbly in the dirt before her. She quietly confessed, her voice barely a whisper, that she had grown to love the 4 babies, exactly as if they were her very own flesh and blood. She revealed that every single time Eleanor had coldly yelled at the infants, she had physically felt the harsh, cruel words striking her own heart. Frederick's strong jaw visibly tightened, the heavy muscles bunching so intensely it looked as though he might actually crack his own teeth under the immense pressure. He filed that highly disturbing information deeply away into the dark, violently furious corner of his complex mind, reserving it for the massive, explosive confrontation that was undoubtedly coming very soon. He took a deep, highly stabilizing breath and swiftly rose to his feet, expertly channeling all of his highly destructive, murderous energy into immediate, highly protective action. He softly announced that it was time to leave. Without any warning whatsoever, he smoothly slid one strong arm beneath the backs of her knees and the other firmly around her back, effortlessly lifting her battered body entirely into the air. As if she weighed absolutely nothing, Penelope let out a tiny, highly surprised gasp, instinctively wrapping her arms tightly around his broad neck to secure her balance. She immediately protested, feeling the immense, solid heat of his body pressing against her through his ruined shirt, insisting that she was perfectly capable of walking to the car now that her feet were bandaged. Frederick's voice was an immovable, solid wall of pure determination as he firmly stated she would absolutely not be walking another single step. He swore that she would never, ever walk on sharp rocks again as long as he possessed the physical strength to carry her himself. He carried her with extreme care toward the waiting sports car, gently depositing her highly exhausted body onto the pristine, highly expensive beige leather of the passenger seat. Penelope immediately tried to shrink into herself, deeply terrified of permanently staining the luxurious luxury interior with her mud-caked uniform. However, Frederick completely ignored the potential damage to his expensive vehicle. He highly, meticulously ensured she was comfortably seated before turning his full attention to carefully loading the 4 highly exhausted infants safely into the spacious back seat. Once the babies were highly secured, Frederick slid into the driver's seat. He did not aggressively turn the ignition immediately. Instead, he turned his body completely toward Penelope, who was anxiously twisting around to constantly check on the sleeping children in the back. He softly called her name, forcing her to look directly at him in the dim, highly intimate lighting of the car's interior. He announced that they were finally going home. He reached out impulsively, his large, incredibly warm hand completely covering her small, heavily trembling fingers resting nervously in her lap. He gave her hand a highly reassuring squeeze, locking eyes with her to ensure she fully understood the immense gravity of his words. He firmly promised her that they were absolutely not returning to the same terrible situation they had left behind. He swore a highly solemn, unbreakable oath, invoking the respected memory of his late father, promising that he was going to completely clean house. He swore that his cruel mother would permanently be removed, and that absolutely no one would ever be allowed to hurt her or his children ever again. He boldly stated that if his mother even dared to utter a single disrespectful word or look at Penelope incorrectly, he would personally throw her out into the street immediately. He intensely asked Penelope if she truly believed him. Penelope stared deeply into his dark eyes and saw an entirely new, incredibly fierce fire burning brightly within them. The highly arrogant, completely detached corporate billionaire was gone. Sitting beside her was a highly motivated, incredibly dangerous protector. She softly whispered that she completely believed him. For the very first time in several highly agonizing months, Penelope finally felt her lungs expand fully, breathing in deeply without the suffocating, crushing weight of constant fear pressing down on her chest. Frederick gave a highly decisive nod, gently releasing her small hand, and finally pressed the ignition button. The highly powerful engine of the sports car roared to life instantly, but this time the loud sound was not aggressive or terrifying. It sounded highly secure and incredibly powerful. Frederick drove the heavy vehicle back down the dark, rocky road with extreme, highly calculated caution, meticulously avoiding every single pothole and sharp bump to ensure the sleeping infants were not disturbed. He was slowly, purposefully driving his newly formed, highly unconventional family directly back to the sprawling Virginia estate, fully preparing himself for the ultimate, highly explosive, final confrontation. The massive, highly intimidating wrought iron gates of the sprawling Virginia estate loomed aggressively in the dark distance, brilliantly illuminated by high-powered security spotlights. Penelope instantly felt the previously calming air completely violently sucked straight out of her lungs. That incredibly beautiful, multi-million-dollar property was absolutely not a safe home to her. It was the highly terrifying, deeply traumatic center of her worst nightmares, the absolute, unquestionable domain, where Eleanor ruled with a highly iron fist. Her breathing became incredibly rapid and highly shallow as she nervously whispered that she couldn't face the matriarch. She frantically warned Frederick that his mother would scream, aggressively threaten to call highly expensive corporate lawyers, and unleash a terrifying level of pure wrath upon them. Frederick gently reached over and softly touched her shoulder, highly demanding her full attention. His voice was incredibly calm, yet possessed a highly terrifying underlying edge of absolute certainty. He firmly reminded her that his mother was absolutely not a highly omnipotent, unkillable monster. He coldly stated that she was simply a highly bitter, deeply controlling older woman whose entire power was derived strictly from his massive bank accounts, his property, and his highly negligent silence. He looked directly at the massive iron gates and boldly declared that tonight he was going to aggressively rip every single ounce of that highly unearned power away from her permanently. He swiftly pulled out his phone and directly called the estate's head of private security, barking highly specific, aggressive orders before the man could even finish greeting him. Frederick's highly authoritative voice sliced through the phone connection like a highly sharpened blade. He aggressively ordered the head of security, Fletcher, to manually open the massive iron gates immediately and to forcibly gather the entire household staff, every single maid, cook, and security guard, directly into the grand, marble-floored foyer within exactly 2 minutes. He violently ended the call without waiting for a confirmation. The heavy, highly imposing iron gates began to slowly swing open with a loud, highly electrical hum. Frederick aggressively pressed his foot down on the accelerator, driving the sports car onto the pristine grounds. He was not sneaking back into his own property like a highly defeated man in the middle of the night. He was aggressively charging in like a highly furious king violently returning to reclaim his hijacked throne. As the car forcefully screeched to a halt in the center of the highly manicured circular driveway right in front of the massive main entrance, they could clearly see the heavy, highly ornate double doors were already thrown wide open. Bright, highly luxurious golden light violently spilled out onto the pristine white marble steps. Several highly anxious staff members were nervously peeking out, frantically whispering amongst themselves. Frederick aggressively killed the engine, plunging the area into a heavy, highly charged silence, thick with static electricity. He swiftly exited the vehicle, completely ignoring his highly deplorable, ruined physical appearance. His expensive trousers were shredded, his shirt stained with blood, but he marched toward the house with such an overwhelming, highly terrifying aura of pure rage that the staff instinctively shrunk back in fear. Frederick aggressively threw open the rear doors and highly carefully extracted two of the sleeping infants, then quickly moved to open Penelope's door. He gently offered his hand, softly encouraging her to step out. Penelope hesitated deeply, looking down at her highly filthy, blood-stained bandages and highly ruined clothes, acutely aware of the pristine, highly polished marble floors waiting inside. She nervously mumbled about ruining the expensive floors, a highly lingering symptom of her deeply ingrained conditioning as a lowly servant. Frederick responded with a highly fierce, aggressive tone, loudly declaring that he actually hoped she completely covered the entire house in thick mud. He firmly stated that the massively expensive mansion was worth significantly less than she was. He physically supported her weight, keeping her highly steady as she held the remaining two babies. Together, they formed a highly bizarre, incredibly striking procession, slowly ascending the grand marble staircase. The highly disheveled, furious billionaire, and the heavily bleeding, highly exhausted nanny, carrying 4 sleeping infants. As they finally crossed the highly intimidating threshold into the massive grand foyer, the freezing, highly artificial air conditioning aggressively hit them. The entire household staff was nervously lined up, exactly as Frederick had aggressively ordered. Fletcher, the highly burly head of security, nervously stepped forward, frantically attempting to explain that Eleanor was currently highly enraged in the drawing room, demanding immediate police action. However, Fletcher completely stopped mid-sentence when he truly saw the highly horrifying condition of Penelope's bloody feet and the strange plastic tags on the infant's wrists. Frederick's booming, highly furious voice aggressively echoed off the massive, highly vaulted ceilings of the grand foyer. He loudly demanded to know exactly what kind of horrific, unforgivable crimes had been actively committed inside his own home right beneath everyone's noses, furiously questioning why absolutely no one had possessed the basic human courage to inform him. The entire line of staff immediately dropped their gazes to the highly polished floor in deep, highly profound shame. They had all known, or highly strongly suspected, the dark truth of Eleanor's actions, but the highly terrifying threat of immediate termination and Eleanor's legendary cruelty had successfully silenced them all. Suddenly, a highly shrill, incredibly authoritative voice violently cut through the heavy, highly tense atmosphere from the top of the grand, sweeping double staircase. Everyone immediately looked up. Eleanor stood proudly on the highly elevated landing, impeccably dressed in a highly expensive pearl gray silk suit, wearing heavy diamond jewelry, looking exactly like a highly enraged queen, looking down upon a highly disappointing peasant uprising. Her face was a highly rigid mask of pure indignation, showing absolutely no signs of genuine maternal concern for the safe return of the infants. She loudly and aggressively scoffed, loudly expressing deep disgust that Frederick had actually brought the highly dangerous criminal back into the house. She aggressively ordered the security team to immediately arrest Penelope, continuing her highly fabricated narrative of a violent kidnapping. She confidently marched down the highly carpeted stairs, violently plugging her nose with a highly expensive lace handkerchief, dramatically complaining about the highly offensive smell of dirt. She aggressively reached her hands directly toward Frederick, attempting to physically snatch baby William from his protective grip. Penelope instantly, violently flinched, instinctively cowering directly behind Frederick's broad back, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. However, Frederick absolutely did not take a single step backward. With a highly sudden, incredibly aggressive movement, he violently stepped forward, completely blocking his mother's physical access to the infants. He leaned his highly furious face so incredibly close to hers that Eleanor could clearly see the deeply terrifying, bloodshot rage violently burning in his eyes. He whispered with a voice so incredibly dark, highly dangerous, and highly lethal that the entire staff collectively held their breath, firmly warning her that if she ever reached for his children again, he would absolutely destroy her. Eleanor froze completely in place, highly petrified by the sheer, unadulterated violence radiating from her normally highly composed son. Her jaw physically dropped open in profound, highly uncharacteristic shock. Never, in his entire life, had Frederick ever raised his voice to her or aggressively challenged her highly supreme authority. She nervously stammered, awkwardly lowering her shaking hands, frantically attempting to manipulate the situation by claiming the lowly nanny had obviously brainwashed him. She loudly accused Penelope of actively torturing the children. Frederick unleashed a highly deafening, terrifying roar that literally caused the highly expensive crystal chandelier hanging above them to physically vibrate. He aggressively declared that her highly pathetic theatrical performance was permanently over, violently revealing that he knew absolutely everything about the forged transfer documents and the illegal broker tags. The highly specific mention of the forged legal documents and the illegal transport tags struck Eleanor like a massive, highly physical blow to the face. Her highly powdered, heavily made-up skin instantly lost all of its color, turning a highly, sickly, pale shade of white. However, her deeply ingrained, highly arrogant superiority complex provided a highly rigid shield that was incredibly difficult to completely shatter. She instantly shifted her highly manipulative tactics from aggressive, outright denial to a highly twisted, sickening form of logical justification. She hissed through her heavily whitened teeth, boldly claiming that she had orchestrated the illegal removal of the infants purely for his own ultimate benefit. She highly cruelly stated that the babies possessed highly defective, entirely unacceptable bloodlines, arguing that they needed to be permanently removed to protect his highly pristine corporate image. Hearing his own mother highly casually confess to a massive, highly illegal conspiracy to permanently dispose of his children caused a highly profound, sickening wave of absolute nausea to violently wash over Frederick. He recognized her words for exactly what they were: highly concentrated, pure, unadulterated evil deeply disguised beneath a highly thin veneer of high society class. Frederick absolutely did not take his burning eyes off his mother's face as he loudly snapped his fingers, aggressively calling for Fletcher, the head of security. Fletcher immediately took a highly crisp, highly decisive step forward, his own personal loyalty completely shifting away from the matriarch the exact second he heard her highly cold confession. Frederick issued a highly ruthless, completely uncompromising order, loudly commanding Fletcher to immediately throw all of his mother's belongings directly onto the front lawn. The heavy silence that violently crashed down upon the grand foyer was absolutely deafening. Eleanor let out a highly nervous, highly high-pitched laugh, completely unable to process the severe reality of the highly aggressive command. She loudly proclaimed that he could not possibly be serious, highly arrogantly reminding him that she was his mother and practically owned the estate. Frederick's voice was completely devoid of any highly recognizable human emotion as he coldly corrected her. He firmly stated that she absolutely did not live there anymore. He gave her exactly 10 minutes to physically vacate the highly expensive premises, aggressively promising that if she was still standing in his foyer when the time expired, Fletcher would highly forcefully drag her out the front doors by her expensive hair. Eleanor completely and violently lost her highly prized composure. Her face violently twisted into an incredibly ugly, highly recognizable mask of pure, unadulterated wrath. She screamed at the top of her lungs, highly aggressively reminding him that she had given him life, claiming he owed his entire highly successful existence entirely to her. She loudly mocked him for violently throwing his own mother out into the dark night simply to protect a highly uneducated, highly worthless servant, and 4 highly illegitimate mistakes. Frederick slowly turned his head to look back at Penelope. She was standing highly, quietly, deeply injured, heavily covered in mud, yet she was holding his precious children with an incredibly infinite, highly profound amount of pure love despite her immense fear. He turned his attention back to his highly furious mother. He firmly declared that he was not throwing her out to protect a servant. He was permanently removing her because she was a highly active, highly dangerous threat to the physical safety of his children. He aggressively stated that for the very first time in his entirely selfish life, he was finally acting exactly like a highly protective father, rather than her highly obedient, deeply manipulated son. Frederick then aggressively pivoted his entire body to face the highly terrified row of household staff. He projected his highly commanding voice, officially announcing that from this exact moment forward, Eleanor was highly strictly forbidden from ever stepping foot onto the massive property again. He highly aggressively threatened that if any staff member ever allowed her inside, they would be immediately, highly, publicly terminated. He then highly, respectfully pointed toward Penelope. He loudly declared to the entire room that Miss Penelope was now the highly, absolute, highly unquestionable authority within the massive household. He firmly stated that whatever she commanded was absolute law, demanding a highly verbal confirmation from the staff. A highly unified, somewhat relieved chorus of agreements echoed loudly throughout the grand hall. A few of the younger maids, who had personally witnessed Eleanor's highly cruel treatment of Penelope over the years, managed to hide highly satisfied smiles. Eleanor frantically looked around the highly opulent room, desperately searching for a single loyal ally, but she found herself completely and entirely alone. Her highly terrifying empire of strict control had completely violently collapsed into highly insignificant dust in under 5 minutes. Eleanor aggressively straightened her highly expensive silk jacket with violently shaking hands. She viciously spat out a highly bitter, venomous prediction, highly aggressively promising Frederick that he would deeply regret this highly rash decision. She loudly swore that he would inevitably come crawling back on his hands and knees, begging for her highly essential guidance the very moment the highly lowly nanny completely ruined his highly structured life. Frederick completely ignored her highly venomous words, abruptly turning his broad back to her in a highly definitive, highly dismissive gesture. He absolutely did not wait to watch her highly humiliating exit. He instantly softened his highly aggressive posture and gently approached Penelope, his entire demeanor highly shifting back to a deeply profound, highly protective tenderness. He softly instructed her that it was highly necessary to get the children upstairs immediately, to give them a highly warm, highly comforting bath, to wash away the highly toxic events of the day. He also gently insisted that her highly injured feet needed immediate, highly professional medical attention. Penelope, with fresh, highly silent tears continuously streaming down her highly dirt-streaked face, simply nodded her head in highly profound gratitude. Together, they slowly ascended the grand marble staircase, completely leaving behind the highly satisfying rhythmic sound of Eleanor's highly expensive heels violently clicking away toward the massive front doors, permanently expelled from her highly cherished, highly tyrannical kingdom into the highly dark, incredibly lonely night. The highly comforting, incredibly rhythmic sound of warm water rapidly filling the massive, highly luxurious soaking tub echoed loudly against the highly imported, perfectly polished Italian marble tiles. This was absolutely not the incredibly cramped, highly uncomfortable, and highly damp service bathroom hidden away in the dark servant quarters where Penelope had previously been highly strictly forced to bathe the quadruplets in absolute secrecy. Frederick had highly intentionally carried them directly into the incredibly massive, highly opulent master suite bathroom. It was a highly expansive, deeply relaxing space that highly resembled a highly expensive, deeply exclusive luxury spa rather than a highly standard washroom, an area highly strictly forbidden to absolutely anyone except the highly wealthy master of the sprawling estate. Frederick, his highly expensive white dress shirt, now highly completely ruined, highly soaked with sweat, heavily stained with mud, and highly clinging to his broad chest, reached out and highly carefully turned off the highly polished golden faucet. He highly gently tested the temperature of the water with his highly sensitive inner elbow, actively mirroring a highly specific, highly protective gesture he had once briefly observed Penelope performing months ago. He softly requested that she hand him the first baby. Penelope highly nervously handed over little Peter, her highly exhausted voice trembling slightly as she gently warned Frederick to be highly careful with the generic soap she had brought, noting that the baby's skin was highly sensitive from the rough journey. Frederick highly seriously nodded his head, swallowing heavily past the highly uncomfortable, highly massive lump of sheer guilt lodged deeply in his throat. He highly gently took the small infant into his large, highly capable arms. As he highly carefully removed the highly filthy, heavily soiled clothing, the bright, highly unforgiving, clinical illumination of the highly expensive halogen bathroom lights violently exposed the highly tragic reality of the children's physical state. They were incredibly thin, highly malnourished, and completely covered in highly severe, heavily irritated stress rashes from being heavily neglected and highly confined in the dusty, highly freezing attic. Frederick let out a highly sharp, highly painful gasp, his entire body violently recoiling in highly profound horror at the sheer depth of the physical neglect. He highly quickly submerged the baby into the highly comforting, highly warm water, desperately hoping to instantly soothe the child's obvious discomfort. However, the highly sudden, highly unexpected change in temperature caused little Peter to highly panic and let out a highly piercing, incredibly distressed scream. Frederick completely panicked, his highly inexperienced hands awkwardly fumbling in the highly slippery water. He frantically looked at Penelope with highly widened, deeply terrified eyes, loudly claiming that he was highly accidentally hurting the baby and desperately begging her to take over. Despite the immense, highly agonizing physical pain radiating violently from her deeply bandaged feet, Penelope highly instinctively dropped to her heavily bruised knees right beside the massive luxury tub, instantly plunging her own highly battered hands into the warm water. She highly firmly but highly gently commanded him not to pull the baby out, softly explaining that the warm water would eventually highly relax the infant's tense muscles. She highly wisely instructed Frederick that he absolutely needed to hold the child with highly confident, highly firm hands, warning him that if he continued to highly violently tremble, the baby would highly instinctively sense his deep fear and panic even more. Frederick took a highly deep, highly shuddering breath, tightly closing his eyes for a brief second to aggressively center his highly chaotic emotions. Penelope highly gently placed her highly rough, heavily calloused hands directly over his highly soft, highly manicured ones, highly expertly guiding his highly awkward movements in the water. She softly instructed him on exactly how to highly securely cradle the baby's fragile head in the highly safe crook of his strong arm, and how to highly gently use his other hand to slowly pour the highly warm water over the infant's back without highly aggressively scrubbing the sensitive skin. Frederick highly obediently followed her highly expert guidance, deeply feeling the highly comforting, highly profound strength of her highly experienced touch, completely grounding him in the highly critical moment. Slowly, the highly relaxing, highly warm water began to work its highly therapeutic magic. Little Peter's highly frantic, highly distressed cries gradually highly subsided, eventually transforming into highly soft, highly rhythmic, highly contented hiccups. When they finally finished highly carefully washing little Peter and highly securely wrapping him in a highly massive, incredibly soft, highly expensive Egyptian cotton towel, Frederick felt as though he had just completed a highly grueling, highly exhausting physical marathon. One by one, working together in highly perfect, highly synchronized harmony, they highly meticulously bathed all four of the highly exhausted infants. They actively washed away the highly heavy, highly suffocating physical dirt of their highly desperate escape, and highly symbolically washed away the deeply toxic, highly dangerous influence of the recently expelled matriarch. When they finally reached the last baby, little Isabella, Frederick completely and highly violently broke down. As he highly gently ran the highly soft sponge over the baby girl's highly tiny, highly fragile feet, a single highly heavy, highly hot tear violently escaped his eye and dropped directly into the highly soapy bathwater, rapidly followed by another, and then another. Frederick let out a highly guttural, highly ugly, highly profound sob. It was the highly devastating sound of an incredibly powerful man, completely violently shattering internally. He heavily collapsed backward, sitting directly on the highly soaking wet, highly expensive marble floor, pulling the highly wrapped baby girl tightly against his highly ruined chest. He highly aggressively wept, openly questioning how he could have been so incredibly, massively blind to his own children's highly profound suffering, heavily punishing himself for his highly unforgivable absence. Penelope, who was highly carefully drying little William nearby, instantly dropped the highly expensive towel and highly quickly moved across the wet floor. She completely ignored her own highly severe physical pain and highly gently sat down right beside him in the highly massive puddle of water, absolutely not caring about ruining her clothes. She softly whispered that he highly genuinely didn't know the truth, highly gently reminding him that his mother was a highly expert, deeply manipulative liar who had highly successfully deceived absolutely everyone in the house. Frederick aggressively shook his head, his face highly red and heavily stained with highly profound tears, loudly arguing that he highly easily could have simply walked upstairs to physically check on them just once. He highly aggressively hit his fist against the wet floor, deeply punishing himself for prioritizing highly stressful corporate meetings over changing a highly simple diaper. He highly painfully reiterated that if Penelope hadn't been highly incredibly brave enough to aggressively scream the truth at him on that dirt road, his children would currently be highly permanently gone. Penelope looked at the highly physically and emotionally destroyed billionaire sitting humbly before her. She no longer saw a highly arrogant, highly intimidating boss. She highly clearly saw a deeply wounded, highly vulnerable father desperately seeking highly profound redemption. In that highly exact moment, the final, highly stubborn wall of deep mistrust within Penelope's highly battered heart completely crumbled away. She highly softly called his name, and with a highly incredibly deep, highly profound timidity, she highly gently reached out and highly softly placed her hand on his highly shaking shoulder. Frederick highly violently shivered at the highly unexpected, highly deeply comforting physical contact. She softly told him that the only thing that highly truly mattered now was that he had finally, highly completely woken up to the highly dangerous reality before it was entirely too late. She gently pointed toward the highly massive, highly luxurious bathroom rug, where the other three highly exhausted babies had already fallen, highly completely deeply asleep, totally exhausted by the highly, highly traumatic day, but finally, highly, highly, entirely safe. She softly whispered that they were currently sleeping highly, highly peacefully, without any highly, highly terrifying fear, simply because they instinctively knew their highly, highly protective father was finally home. She highly, highly gently assured him that the highly, highly absent corporate billionaire was permanently gone, and the highly, highly deeply caring man currently sitting and weeping on the bathroom floor was exactly the highly, highly devoted father they desperately needed. Frederick looked highly deeply at his sleeping children, taking a highly, highly massive, highly shuddering breath, deeply filling his lungs with the highly, highly clean, highly steamy air. He highly, highly, roughly wiped the heavy tears from his highly red eyes using the highly, highly wet back of his hand. He highly, highly, profoundly whispered a highly, highly, incredibly deep, highly, highly sincere thank you directly into her highly, highly tear-filled eyes, thanking her for never, highly, highly, ever giving up on his highly, highly innocent children, and more importantly, for never highly, highly giving up on him. In that highly, highly messy, highly, highly steam-filled bathroom, entirely surrounded by highly, highly discarded wet towels, and the highly, highly chaotic aftermath of a massive, highly, highly emotional breakdown, a highly, highly profound, highly indestructible bond was permanently forged between them. It was not highly, highly traditional, highly, highly, highly romantic love just yet. It was something significantly, highly, 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 much stronger. It was a highly, highly fierce, highly unbreakable alliance forged entirely in the highly, highly, highly intense fires of absolute highly, highly, highly sheer survival. 30 minutes later, the four highly, highly exhausted quadruplets were highly, highly sleeping incredibly soundly in the center of the highly, highly massive, highly, highly luxurious bed in the master suite, heavily surrounded by highly, highly soft pillows, forming a highly, 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 highly secure fortress. Penelope was sitting highly, highly quietly in a highly, highly expensive, highly, highly plush velvet armchair in the corner of the highly, highly massive room, intensely watching the babies as if she highly, highly, deeply feared they might simply vanish into thin air if she even dared to blink. The highly, highly heavy mahogany door slowly pushed open, and Frederick highly, highly, highly quietly stepped inside. He had finally, highly, highly, completely changed out of his highly, highly ruined suit, now wearing a highly, highly simple, highly, highly comfortable black t-shirt and casual pants. He carried a highly, highly, heavily loaded silver tray of highly, highly fresh, highly, highly, highly expensive food, and highly, highly tucked firmly under his other arm was a highly, highly pristine, highly, highly, fully stocked, white medical box. He highly, highly, gently placed the heavy tray onto the small table directly beside her, highly, highly softly noting that she absolutely had not eaten a single thing in over 24 hours. He highly, highly gently commanded her to eat immediately, stating that while she ate, he was going to highly, highly, properly finish the highly, highly important medical work he had started in the dirt. He highly, highly, respectfully kneeled down directly in front of her chair, opening the highly, highly expensive medical kit. Penelope highly, highly, instinctively tried to pull her highly, highly bandaged feet away, highly, highly, nervously protesting that she was perfectly fine. Frederick highly, highly, firmly, but highly, highly, gently held her ankles, stating that the highly, 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 highly temporary bandages he applied on the car hood were completely insufficient. He highly carefully removed the dirty gauze, highly meticulously applying a highly expensive, highly soothing antibiotic cream to her highly deep wounds. He softly informed her that his legal team had already highly successfully secured a highly ironclad restraining order against his mother, permanently banning her from the entire state, and that he was completely restructuring his entire, massive, highly corporate life to permanently stay home. He looked highly deeply into Penelope's highly wide, highly surprised eyes, his highly powerful hands gently resting on her highly bandaged feet. He highly firmly declared that she was absolutely not going to be the highly lowly nanny anymore. He highly confidently stated that he wanted her to be his highly equal partner in raising the children, highly officially giving her full authority over the entire household. He gently pressed a highly brand new, highly expensive gold bank card into her highly trembling hand, highly promising her that she would never, highly ever have to run away in fear ever again. Penelope highly tightly clutched the card to her highly beating heart. Finally, highly entirely, allowing herself to believe that the deeply highly terrifying nightmare was truly highly completely over. 3 full weeks had passed since that highly incredibly chaotic, highly terrifying day on the highly isolated dirt road, and the highly massive Virginia estate was now highly completely unrecognizable. The highly incredibly suffocating, highly heavy velvet curtains had been permanently removed, replaced by highly light, highly breezy linen that allowed the highly bright, highly warm sunshine to permanently flood the massive, highly luxurious rooms. The highly terrifying, highly strictly formal atmosphere had completely vanished. Penelope sat highly comfortably on a highly soft blanket on the manicured lawn, highly actively watching the 4 babies highly happily playing in the grass, completely free from highly any restrictive tags or highly abusive neglect. Frederick highly warmly approached from the massive highly main house, highly casually carrying 2 highly cold glasses of highly fresh lemonade. He highly completely relaxed, sitting directly beside her on the highly blanket, not highly acting like a highly intimidating boss, but as a highly equal, deeply highly devoted partner. He highly smoothly handed her a highly cold glass, highly softly informing her that his highly expensive legal team had highly officially confirmed that Eleanor had highly permanently relocated to a highly distant, heavily secured retirement facility far away. Penelope highly softly smiled a highly deep, highly profound sense of absolute peace, highly, completely washing over her. She highly gently rested her head against his highly strong shoulder as they both watched little William successfully highly pull himself up to stand on his own 2 feet. For the very first time, Frederick highly excitedly gasped, his highly face completely lighting up with pure, highly unadulterated fatherly joy. He highly gently took Penelope's hand, looking deeply into her highly peaceful eyes, his own eyes. Highly filled with profound highly love and deep highly admiration. He highly softly stated that she was already highly the true mother to these highly children in absolutely every single way that mattered. He slowly, highly pulled a highly official legal document from his pocket. It was not a highly romantic marriage proposal just yet, but a highly complete, fully processed formal adoption petition. Officially, highly requesting that Penelope become their highly legal mother. Penelope burst into highly happy tears, immediately throwing her arms tightly around him. The journey of Penelope and Frederick teaches us an incredibly profound lesson about the true nature of family, wealth, and the unimaginable strength of the human spirit. Real family is absolutely not defined merely by the accidental sharing of blood or a prestigious last name inherited through generations. True family is actively forged in the fires of genuine sacrifice, unwavering protection, and the profound willingness to stand between innocent lives and the darkness of the world. Wealth, in its most common form of massive bank accounts and sprawling estates, is a dangerous illusion that can easily blind us to the emotional decay happening right beneath our own roofs. Frederick possessed infinite financial resources, yet he was entirely bankrupt in the currency of presence and love, allowing comfort to replace his fundamental duty as a father. It was only when a seemingly powerless young woman, armed with nothing but empty pockets and fiercely bleeding feet, demonstrated the sheer terrifying power of absolute devotion that he finally awoke from his gilded slumber. We must actively remember that true courage does not require a position of authority or a suit of armor. It simply requires a heart that refuses to look away from suffering. We must never allow the pursuit of professional success to deafen us to the quiet, desperate cries of those who depend on our protection. The deepest, most enduring wealth a person can ever possess is not locked away in a steel vault, but is found entirely in the dirt-stained hands of those who are willing to walk through hell to keep us safe, proving that love is not merely a spoken word, but a highly active, relentlessly protective force.